This is 55th International Congress. For me, it's my 10th FITCE paper, so it's kind of 20% that is not bad. And another important thing I realized when I looked at this session, I said, Italy, Spain, Greece, is this on financial markets or this is on telecommunications? And in fact, I'm going to talk about rural networks and the deployment of next generation networks in these rural areas is connected to a certain extent at the situation of financial markets. And one more thing, I want you to look at this picture of Spain. It's one of these pictures taken from a satellite. It looks at light, but it gives a very nice picture of where it's possible to deploy networks, because networks of this type are going to be deployed where people is, where light is, basically. And this looks like the Mediterranean coast is where there's a high density of population, the central area, the central core, like Madrid. And then you can see some light over there in the north coast, is where we used to have our industrial, the more important part of our industrial sector. It used to be in the north. And this is more or less all. The rest of Spain is rather rural and with lack of light. There are a number of points scattered all around the place. Well, let's go. And instead of going, because it's late and you haven't had lunch, and me too, this is also my case, I'm going, instead of going through a very detailed presentation with a lot of figures and tables and very nice, I'm going to jump directly to conclusions, but I'm going to use this index just to give you some basic ideas, because without them it will be impossible to understand the conclusions. The first thing is there this connection between, obvious connection between broadband and economic development, but, and now I belong to the academy, and not I was working for a while with the policymakers, but now being in the academy I can say, I think, the real things. Next generation networks is not the same as talking about broadband. We are talking about ultra broadband. And yes, there is this connection probably between ultra broadband deployment and economic development, but it's not the same to have no broadband at all and having 10 megabits per second. Yes, there's a big, huge economic development impact, but moving from 10 megabits per second to 50 or 100 maybe doesn't have the same type of impact. And this is an important thing, and it should be mentioned. Second point is, what is an NGN? And there is not a clear definition. I mean, everybody talks about number of megabits per second, but it's 30, it's 50, it's 100, and it's symmetrical, it is not. And what about quality of service? No one is really talking, and policymakers are just launching figures like 30 megabits per second for all, but it's actually what it means. What does it mean? This is an important thing also to be mentioned when doing cost calculations and presenting on this topic. And third, another part of NGN is this ubiquity. I mean, it is supposed to be an ubiquitous network. And what does it mean again? Well, it looks like reaching everybody, but this everybody is everybody on the move, or is everybody when they are in a fixed position? And taking this second approach, it looks like premises. So it's not exactly where people live, it's also where people work. And this also should be taken into account. But again, we should, if we want to do precise figures, we have to define this with detail. And third, situation of Spain, well, we don't have. I mean, okay, we have some fiber to the home, very little, but basically as this FTTH hardcore concept, we don't have any today. I mean, small figures, no. Okay, it's more or less what the situation that Gianfranco has presented in the first slide for the overall Europe, and Spain is a good example. It's on the average, basically. Point number 2, rural scenario. How does it look, Spain, with some detail? It's very easy. It's about 46%, 50 if you want simple figures to remind. 50% of the population lives in urban areas. So this is easy. We have another 10% that lives in kind of suburban areas. So it's something that could be reached with a bit of effort. So altogether it's like 60 in urban plus suburban areas. And the rest of the people, 40%, lives in basically rural areas. And we have a final 12% of the population who use like 80% of the territory. So this is very rural areas, basically. So easy to remember, 60, this. And this final 12%. Okay, this is Spain, this is the rural scenario. And there's another point here interesting, always sometimes forgotten. I mean, and these people, they live all together. If you've traveled around Sicily, Sicily is a good example because you have a very big difference between the interior and the coast. In the interior, people live like in big parts of Spain, all together in a village, and there's nothing. There are empty fields all around. But Sicily has also this coast where there are a lot of houses. And at some point, it's even difficult to tell when a city ends and when starts the next one, because there are houses all over the place. And this is also typical of some part of Spain. So we have the two types of say, ubication of premises, and we have to take into account that when making calculations, especially for the rural areas, because the costs are completely different. And just throwing figures and supposing that all the people live together in a village, that's completely wrong. And the other model is also completely wrong. It's a mix, and you have to do some precise calculations on that. Technologies, I'm going or the paper, you have all the details, obviously, in the paper, in the proceedings of the conference. I've used that list of technologies to make the comparisons. Some of them has not much sense when looking at the rural areas, but I think they give an overall picture that is interesting. The methodology tells about all the assumptions, but basically the presentation from Gianfranco is to this regard is very right, because we have tried to use the more realistic approach. We were able, so the split ratio is more or less what you have presented. It is easy. And in the results, we have a lot of nice tables with the CAPEX, OPEX, and level of investment required, some sensitivity analysis. But as I mentioned, I'm going to jump directly to conclusions that I think it will be more interesting. Okay. So this is like only 7 slides. So you can count them, and when we reach the 7, this is finished. So the first one, this should be like this could be like the very naive approach. What if I will try to put Spain, especially these rural areas, with the closest to NGN, and using everything that is on the table? So that means jumping over competition issues, and it will be like the floor of the cost in the case of Spain. And the important part for the rural areas is from this, remember, from this 60 to the end. Okay, but I'm going to use the full figures because I think it will give you more meaningful ideas. The first thing you can notice is the simplest. We have cable in Spain. And where does this cable goes to? Obviously, to the urban areas, because it's where it was cheaper and where the cost has sense, taking into consideration the RPU from the users. So, first idea, DOCSIS is interesting, cable, sorry, and DOCSIS has the solution to move to next generation networks on top of existing cable networks. Is an interesting solution, but it's worthless, completely worthless for rural areas. So let's forget about cable. However, it's interesting in a general picture on NGN. So in that sense, we shouldn't forget. What can we use then? Well, the simplest moving from this cable will be to use some copper wire solution, completing it with fiber as required. So this looks like some VDSL. The speeds wouldn't be homogeneous, it will depend on the distances, so this would be like something like an average. It's also very coherent with the figures that Giancarlo has mentioned, like something like 40 in average, downstream, something like that. And using all that we have, all our ammunition, all our weapons, whatever we have, we can maybe reach this 88% of the population with that. But we still have this difficulty with people who live in very rural areas. This is the geographic gap that you mentioned, and very precisely. And for that kind of people, the only feasible thing in reality will be something like 4G. some type of LTE or something similar. So with all of this, we will have something like an investment average per customer. Here we have to do some additional assumptions on market share per operator. Something like in the mark of 700, 600, 700 euros per customer will be, to do this very naive, it will be impossible. This will be like the floor. No? And also notice that I decided to define NGN something like 30 megabits downstream. That is a very low profile NGN, something is very little. Okay. With that, we will be able to have 100% coverage of this mix of technologies in 2020 in a place like Spain. That will be, it will be the okay. Let's look at some additional details of interest. As I mentioned, the cheapest will be to reuse cable. Basically, to move from existing cable to cable with DOCSIS is nothing, it's peanuts compared to some other figures. But it's also interesting to realize that some people live very close to central offices in the old telephone network. This is in the case of Spain something like 20%, and then you don't have to do practically nothing. You only have to put some additional equipment in the central offices, and then you reach these people. This is also very cheap, and this 20% is something like a bit like a constant figure. I mean, it's true in urban areas, but it's also true basically in rural areas. Not in very rural areas, but in rural areas it's true because there are 20% of people that live close enough to the central office, because this central office was put at the beginning of time at typically in the city center, no? of these basically villages. Okay. So not to forget the impact that, or the money we can save reusing this copper wire directly from the central offices. So that means 20% of operation with a significant, maybe 40, 50 megabits per second, and that will be rather homogeneous through the country. So it's in that sense good news. This slide is also important because of the message on the top. It says, this is realistic. So I don't know what the policymakers tell, but this is the realistic. This is a very realistic situation for Spain in 4 years' time. It looks like 50% of the population with something NGN, and this is coming because of this cable we have, so it's almost there by now, and rest of the people like nothing. So this could be well the situation. Here I should again insist on this copper wire, although again has mentioned it. It looks like policymakers and regulators, especially, no? They want FTTH. Oh, okay, that's very nice of you, but reality is still we can use copper wire for a while. Yeah? And this is engineering, and this is, I'm also an economist. This is economy. I mean, it doesn't make sense to throw all of these assets away and not using them. So I think this is going to happen, and you know, some of the technologies have been already been mentioned, and it makes sense. It's smoother, it's more scalable, and the only problem is, and what we do with current regulation, because it doesn't fit completely into the picture. If copper wire is still to be used, let's forget about legacy networks. We don't care. No, I mean, they are important. And is this feasible with the current model of competition? So this is a big question. I'm not going to enter too much into regulatory questions, only something about the spectrum at the end, but something that should be considered. It's not as easy as it looks when we're moving from the old world to the new world. Still will be very important regulation on copper wire for many years. Wireless, and I'm going to defend a bit wireless. And obviously, the type of speeds that you can get, and again, it has been mentioned in previous presentations a bit, that you can get with 4G, I mean, they are very, very low compared to this FTTH. That is true. When people from the wireless industry they talk, many times they speak about peak speeds. So that creates confusion. because obviously in wireless networks and mobile networks, you have a high degree of sharing. So what is peak and what is an average throughput is rather different. Okay. What could be something feasible? Something, I mean, not feasible today. It will be require a bit of industry improvements and maybe a couple of things, a couple of tricks, and obviously it will require a spectrum. But something like 5 megabits per second per user, guaranteed, it could happen. I mean, not today, it could happen. Okay. And come on, 5 megabits per second for each of you now, here, wireless, it's not bad. I mean, and you move around and you have this 5 megabits per second. Of course, it's not NGN, it's not 30 megabits, but if I have to decide between 30 megabits fixed at home and 5 megabits per second guaranteed all over the country, all over the country, I put all over the country until 100%. Makes a difference. And what would be required to deploy this 5 megabits per second in a place like Spain? And think about Spain like the average European country. You know? It's, in terms of population and distribution of population, it's like an average, basically. And that will require a lot of fiber, because you have to take these base stations very close to the users. So if you look around, for example, in a place like Madrid, where I live, or in many other places in Spain, who are the operators who are deploying fiber? Basically the mobile operators. It's the mobile operators deploying fiber, because they have to put these base stations for LTE very close to users. When with these kind of figures, you are putting maybe, or you should have something like it looks more like a pico cell, something like that. No, maybe you have one cell per 500, 1,000 users. You have to go down to that type of thing. So you need to really bury a lot of fiber. That means that although we don't have, we are not reaching the figures of the fixed solutions, that could have a huge impact in urban environment, and of course it will have a very high, even would be the only solution in rural environment, and obviously the only feasible thing in very rural environment. And that should be taken into account. Okay. Here you have, I'm not stopping at the figures, but if you're interested, you can have some more or less figures for each of these scenarios. So putting all together, Spain could look like this in 4 or 5 years, something like this. It looks like this 2+ competition for maybe 50–60% of the population. That means we have some, hopefully, some users with fiber to the home. We have different combinations of fiber to the cab, or maybe fiber to the building. In Spain we use, in some parts we live in big buildings, so that could be also possible. We have this cable upgraded to DOCSIS 3.0, and we have some other solutions, basically basic on copper wire, until this 60%. So we have there a frontier. This is, in the European Commission terminology, this will be the black areas, more or less. Then we have the gray areas, looks like our Telefonica, no? Our Telecom Italia, our yeah.
Can you close?
I'm about to finish it. And at the end, we only have this wireless solution, and maybe the mobile all over. The mobile is the reason to have a plus. It's a 2+ competition. It's a 1+ competition because of the mobile. Okay. So final remarks. Looking a bit in the regulatory perspective. There is not a technology that solves every problem, so we are probably going to see operators using a mix of technologies, and then we need the regulation be prepared for these operators using a mix of technologies. If we are not, they could not use all the benefits, all the potential benefits of using this mix of technologies. And also we have to remind that at different starting point, I mean, operators are not going to throw the assets they already have. So this should be taken also into account. And I don't see it happening, at least in Spain. There are different transition paths. There are huge risks due to this external management. I mean, policymakers and regulators knowing what should be the results of these NGNs. And I see still many uncertainties, to be sure, which is the final result. And important for spectrum, because I was concentrating on rural areas. Yes, we need more spectrum. Yes, we need the spectrum on the digital dividend side, but this won't solve fully the question, because this spectrum will only decrease the cost to deploy now something, but this is not enough to put really these 5 megabits per second I was talking. And doing some approximate figures, one can think about wireless solutions like being maybe like 4 years in delay with regard to fixed, or maybe dividing by 10 the current speeds we are thinking about in the fixed world. But as well as there are solutions moving into the 1 gigas in the fixed world, there are also some wireless solutions moving into the 1 gigas domain. And this should be taken into account, and this is why for the rural areas, for Europe, we need spectrum and a nice policy about releasing spectrum in all over Europe.